Good evening, friends. I want to talk with you tonight about something very big, very historic, and very difficult. The title of my talk is After Tonight, Israel Will Never Be the Same. And I don't mean that as hyperbole. I mean that we are witnessing a society, an economy, and a political structure that has reached a breaking point, the kind of breaking point that once crossed, cannot be reversed. History does not give do-overs. Once the contradictions of a system come to the surface, they have to be addressed. If they are ignored, they don't go away, they deepen, and they force transformations, whether people like it or not. Israel today is at such a crossroads. Its economy is under strain, its politics are more fractured than ever before, and its society is divided into communities that increasingly cannot see one another as part of the same nation. This is not sustainable, and history shows us what happens when contradictions reach this level. So in this first session, I want to set the stage. I want to look at Israel's trajectory, where it came from, how its economic and political model developed, and what contradictions have been piling up to bring us to this historic moment. Let's start with the economy. When Israel was founded in 1948, it had a very particular economic structure. It was a mixed economy with heavy state involvement. Large parts of production land and infrastructure were collectively owned or operated through the state or quasi-public institutions like the Histadrut, which was the dominant trade union but also an economic player in its own right. This collectivist, state-led model was not an accident. It was necessary. Israel was a small, isolated country surrounded by hostile neighbors, dependent on waves of immigration and lacking natural resources. To survive, it needed massive state planning, redistribution, and coordination. And for decades, that worked. Israel built up infrastructure, absorbed immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, and developed its agricultural and industrial base. It was not a neoliberal free market paradise. It was a carefully managed hybrid. But as with so many societies, that model began to shift in the 1980s and 1990s under pressure from global capitalism, from the United States, from the IMF, from multinational corporations. Israel liberalized. It privatized state industries, cut back on subsidies, deregulated finance, and opened itself to global capital flows. The startup nation narrative, the idea of Israel as a hub of high-tech innovation, was built on this shift. What this meant was twofold. On the one hand, Israel became a global player in tech, cybersecurity, and venture capital. But on the other hand, inequality skyrocketed. The earlier promise that the state would integrate diverse populations, provide social welfare, and guarantee security started to erode. By the 2000s and 2010s, Israel had one of the highest inequality rates in the developed world. Housing costs soared, wages stagnated for many. The startup nation enriched a small elite, often tied to the military-industrial complex, while leaving large parts of the population behind. So the economic story is one of a society that began with collective survival, then moved into neoliberal integration with global capitalism, and in doing so created deep internal divisions. Now, let's overlay politics. Israel has always been politically complex. From the beginning, it was a settler colonial project in conflict with the indigenous Palestinian population. That contradiction was never resolved. It was managed, sometimes through war, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through occupation, but never resolved. Internally, Israeli politics were shaped by divisions between Ashkenazi Jews of European origin and Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews from the Middle East and North Africa. Later waves of immigration, Russian, Ethiopian, and others, added new layers. For decades, the Labor Party dominated politics, representing the secular Ashkenazi socialist-leaning elite. But beginning in the 1970s, the right wing, spearheaded by Likud, rose to power, channeling resentment from Mizrahi Jews and religious communities who felt excluded by the labor establishment. Benjamin Netanyahu is the culmination of that transformation, his brand of politics. Nationalist, neoliberal, and deeply polarizing, has dominated Israel for more than 2 decades. He represents the merging of economic neoliberalism with political authoritarianism. But here is the contradiction. This political system relies on perpetual crisis. It needs enemies, external enemies like Palestinians, Arabs, and Iranians, and internal enemies like the liberal elites or the judiciary to justify its hold on power. That constant mobilization of fear and division works for a while, but it erodes the capacity of society to function. It turns politics into permanent war where compromise becomes impossible. And so we arrive today at a situation where the political system is paralyzed. Netanyahu is clinging to power despite corruption charges. The opposition is fragmented. The judiciary is under attack. Protest movements are erupting in the streets. And the state cannot govern with legitimacy. Finally, let's consider society. Israeli society is not one society. It is multiple societies stitched together uneasily. You have secular Jews, religious Jews, ultra-Orthodox communities, Mizrahi and Ashkenazi divides, immigrants from Russia and Ethiopia, and of course, the 20% of the population that is Palestinian Arab citizens of Israel. These groups live in different neighborhoods, send their children to different schools, often speak different languages, and vote for different parties. In many cases, they barely interact. What has held this fragmented society together has been 2 things: the sense of external threat, the idea that Israel is surrounded and must unite for survival, and the promise of economic advancement, that Israel is a modern, dynamic economy with opportunities for all. But now both of those adhesives are cracking. The external threat narrative is less convincing to younger generations who see the occupation not as a defensive necessity, but as an ongoing moral and political disaster. And the economic promise has faltered as inequality has grown in housing and wages have become unbearable. So society itself is fragmenting. People are retreating into their own communities, mistrusting one another, and increasingly unwilling to see themselves as part of a common project. Now, you may be wondering, why do I say that after tonight? Israel will never be the same. What makes this moment so decisive? It is because the contradictions I have described, economic, political, and social, are converging. They are no longer separate pressures that can be managed individually. They are reinforcing one another. The economy is feeding the politics of division. The politics of division are deepening social fractures. The social fractures are undermining the economy. This is the classic recipe for systemic crisis. And systemic crises do not end with a return to the status quo. They force transformation. We don't yet know what form that transformation will take. It could be authoritarian consolidation an even harsher regime doubling down on militarism and neoliberalism. Or it could be rupture, mass mobilization from below that forces a new political and economic arrangement. But what is clear is that the old Israel, the Israel of the startup nation, the Israel of endless occupation, and yet endless international legitimacy, the Israel of fragmented but somehow stable politics, that Israel is over. History has moved. The contradictions have become unmanageable. And after tonight, Israel will never be the same. So in this first session, we have set the table. We have looked at the economic trajectory, the political evolution, and the social fragmentation of Israel. We see how each of these areas is in crisis and how together they form a systemic contradiction that cannot continue. In the next session, we will look more closely at the economic dynamics, particularly inequality, housing, and the role of militarism and high tech, and how they are driving the current moment. For now, remember, history teaches us that societies built on unresolved contradictions eventually face reckoning. And Israel tonight is at that reckoning. Friends, to grasp why I say Israel will never be the same after tonight, we have to think historically, we have to think economically, and we have to think in terms of contradictions that accumulate over decades until they become unbearable. Nothing about this moment arrived suddenly. It is the product of a long trajectory of choices made by governments, by elites, by corporations, by military planners, and yes, by ordinary citizens who navigated this system, sometimes resisting, sometimes accommodating, often surviving. And what we are witnessing is the accumulation of unresolved contradictions bursting through the surface. You see, Israel was built in a moment of enormous global transformation after the Second World War, in the shadow of the Holocaust, in the midst of decolonization. It presented itself as both a haven for Jews worldwide and as a Western aligned outpost in the Middle East. Those dual roles carried promises, but also contradictions. The promise was security and prosperity for Jewish immigrants arriving from shattered Europe, from hostile Arab regimes, from the Soviet Union, later from Ethiopia. The contradiction was that this project was built on land already inhabited, already claimed by Palestinians. That contradiction from 1948 onward has never been resolved, only managed. Sometimes with brutal force, sometimes with negotiation, but always unresolved. The economy of Israel is a telling story of how societies change when global capitalism changes. In the early decades, survival required collective effort. Immigrants needed housing, food, jobs, health care. The state had to step in, had to control resources, had to plan. And people accepted that because it was literally about survival. That model produced real achievements. Literacy soared, universities were built, industries emerged. But in the 1980s, as neoliberalism swept the globe under Reagan and Thatcher, Israel was pulled into the orbit of financial capitalism. Privatization was presented as modernization. Deregulation was sold as efficiency. Suddenly, the rhetoric shifted from building a society to competing in global markets. And here is where the inequality begins. The high-tech elite flourished. Venture capital poured in. Tel Aviv became a hub of startups. But who got left behind? Ordinary workers, Mizrahi Jews, Palestinian citizens of Israel, the ultra-Orthodox communities who did not fit into the model of global entrepreneurship. They bore the costs of austerity, of housing bubbles, of stagnant wages. When you have an economy that rewards a small minority with global prestige and condemns the majority to struggle, you are laying the foundation for explosive political discontent. And we see that discontent in the protests, in the polarization, in the endless cycles of election after election, coalition after coalition, none of them stable. Netanyahu, more than any other figure, embodies this contradiction. He is the champion of neoliberal economics, friendly to billionaires, to privatization, to foreign investors. At the same time, he presents himself as the nationalist defender of the Jewish state, the strongman who alone can protect Israel from enemies. He has convinced millions that these two identities are compatible, the global capitalist and the local nationalist. But in reality, they pull against each other. You cannot serve the interests of global finance and also claim to serve the interests of ordinary citizens who are priced out of housing, burdened by debt, and excluded from the prosperity that finance delivers. That contradiction is tearing Israeli politics apart. And then there is the society itself. We must be honest, Israel is not one people, not one culture, not one community. It is a patchwork. Ashkenazi Jews dominate the economy and culture, but Mizrahi Jews remember decades of marginalization. Russian immigrants brought their own political leanings, often nationalist and secular. Ethiopian immigrants face racism and exclusion. Ultra-Orthodox communities demand subsidies and autonomy. Palestinian citizens, a fifth of the population, live with systematic discrimination. This is not a society that has solved its internal divisions. It has layered them, papered over them, pretended they are manageable, and for decades, the glue holding this patchwork together has been twofoldy. First, the external enemy, the perpetual threat that demands unity against Palestinians, Arabs, Iranians, and second, the promise of growth, of modernity of Israel as a successful Western-style society in the Middle East. But those adhesives are failing. Young people question the narrative of external threat. They see endless occupation, endless war, endless militarism, and they ask, is this really security or is it permanent conflict? And the economic promise feels hollow when wages stagnate, when apartments in Tel Aviv are beyond reach, when inequality is among the highest in the OECD. So tonight, what is happening is not just another flare-up, not just another crisis in a long line of crises. This is different because the contradictions are converging. The economic inequality fuels political anger. The political paralysis deepens social mistrust. The social divisions undermine economic development. Everything is feeding on everything else, producing a spiral that cannot stabilize. When I say Israel will never be the same, I mean that the illusion of stability is gone. For years, Israeli leaders could project to the world and to their own citizens that despite the conflicts, despite the wars, despite the protests, the system was fundamentally stable. But it is no longer convincing. The mass protests against judicial reform, the repeated electoral deadlocks, the corruption trials of Netanyahu, the rising cost of living, the growing refusal of young people to accept the status quo. These are not isolated events. They are signs of systemic breakdown. And here, history teaches us something crucial. When contradictions accumulate to this degree, the system must change. It cannot return to what it was. The only question is what form the change will take. Will it be authoritarian, with more repression, more militarism, more concentration of wealth and power, justified by the claim of existential threat? Or will it be democratic and transformative, pushed by mass movements demanding equality, justice, and an end to occupation? We cannot know yet, but we can say with confidence that the old model is finished. The startup nation myth. The idea that Israel can be both a neoliberal capitalist hub and a cohesive society is shattered. The promise that occupation can be managed indefinitely without tearing the society apart is broken. The belief that divisions can be held together by external threats is collapsing. This is why, after tonight, Israel will never be the same, because history is not just about leaders and armies, it is about structures. Structures of economy, of politics, of society, and those structures are cracking. Once they crack, they cannot be glued back together as they were. They will be reassembled in some new form through struggle, through conflict, through negotiation. But never again will Israel be what it was in the decades past. And this is not unique to Israel. Every society faces its contradictions. The United States faces them in inequality, in racial injustice, in climate disaster. Europe faces them in austerity, in migration crises, in the rise of the far right. Israel is a particularly sharp example, a society built on extraordinary contradictions, now facing the moment when those contradictions cannot be hidden. So tonight we are witnesses to history, not in the sense of a single dramatic event, but in the sense of a turning point, a moment after which the story cannot be told the same way. That is what I mean when I say Israel will never be the same. If we turn now to the economy of Israel in its present form, we can see why the crises unfolding today are not sudden or mysterious, but the logical outcome of decades of economic restructuring. The story begins with neoliberal reforms that were introduced in the 1980s and accelerated in the 1990s. These reforms were not unique to Israel. They were part of a global shift under pressure from the United States, international financial institutions, and multinational corporations. What Israel did was to dismantle, piece by piece, the collectivist and state-oriented economic framework of its early years. Public enterprises were privatized, social spending was curtailed, and markets were liberalized to attract foreign investment. This is what produced the startup nation narrative, the image of Israel as a cutting-edge hub of innovation, technology, and global finance. But like all such stories under capitalism, it was a partial truth hiding deeper contradictions. Yes, there was real innovation, real technological development, and real foreign investment. But the benefits were highly concentrated. A small elite in Tel Aviv and a few other centers reaped enormous gains, while much of the population faced stagnant wages, precarious employment, and rising costs of living. The same neoliberal wave that enriched a minority also gutted social protections that had once cushioned the majority. Housing provides perhaps the starkest example. Israel has one of the most expensive housing markets in the world relative to average income. Real estate speculation, fueled by global investors and local elites, has driven prices far beyond what ordinary families can afford. Young people find themselves unable to buy apartments, often forced to live with parents well into adulthood or to take on crushing debt. Rents in urban centers, especially Tel Aviv, have become astronomical. This is not an accident. It is the predictable outcome of deregulation, privatization of land management, and speculative finance. In 2011, there were massive protests against the cost of living, sparked by outrage over housing prices. Those protests brought hundreds of thousands into the streets, but like many movements under capitalism, they were eventually absorbed, diffused, and left without lasting structural change. Yet the grievances that fueled them have only deepened. Inequality, too, has soared. Israel is now among the most unequal societies in the OECD. The gap between rich and poor is vast, with wealth concentrated in the hands of a small elite, while large segments of the population struggle to get by. Palestinian citizens of Israel, about a fifth of the population, consistently face higher unemployment, lower wages, and poorer access to public services. Mizrahi Jews often remain in working class positions with less wealth than their Ashkenazi counterparts. Ethiopian immigrants face systemic discrimination and poverty. Meanwhile, the high-tech sector and the military-industrial complex generate enormous wealth, but only for those positioned to benefit from them. In short, the economic miracle is very uneven, and that unevenness maps directly onto social and political fractures. And here we must talk about militarism because the Israeli economy is deeply entangled with the military apparatus. Israel spends a huge proportion of its GDP on defense, among the highest in the world. This constant militarization has multiple economic consequences. First, it diverts resources away from social spending. Money that could fund housing, education, or healthcare goes instead to weapons, surveillance systems, and endless military operations. Second, it creates a peculiar kind of dependency because Israel's military sector is not just defensive, it is a major export industry. Israeli firms are global leaders in cybersecurity, drones, surveillance technologies, and military hardware. These are sold around the world, often tested first on Palestinians under occupation. This means that militarism is not just a cost, it is also a source of profit for Israeli capital. The more conflict persists, the more justification there is for military research and development, and the more products are generated for export. It is a vicious cycle. Occupation sustains militarism, militarism sustains profit, profit sustains inequality, and inequality fuels political instability. What does this mean for ordinary Israelis? It means that they live in a society where the priorities are skewed. The state subsidizes the military and the settlers while cutting social programs. Young people are conscripted not only to serve, but to become part of a system in which military experience often translates into privileged positions in the high-tech sector. Those who do not have access to those networks remain excluded, struggling with precarious work and high costs. Ultra-Orthodox communities often exempt themselves from military service while demanding subsidies, creating resentment among secular Jews. Palestinian citizens are excluded from the military altogether and thus from many of the economic benefits tied to it. So the military is not only a defense institution, it is also a gatekeeper of privilege, an economic sorting mechanism that structures inequality across society. Neoliberal capitalism in Israel thus has a particular character. It is fused with militarism, dependent on external capital flows, and deeply intertwined with occupation. The occupation of Palestinian territories has economic functions beyond politics. It provides cheap labor when needed. It creates markets for Israeli goods. It secures land for settlement expansion, and it serves as a testing ground for surveillance and security technologies. All of these reinforce the economic order, even as they perpetuate political conflict. But such an arrangement cannot last indefinitely because the contradictions mount. The international legitimacy of endless occupation erodes. The global economy shifts, creating new vulnerabilities. Internally, the inequality breeds discontent and protest. What you then have is a society unable to reconcile its economic model with its political and social needs. And here is where the present crisis becomes clearer. The judicial reform battles, the massive street protests, the deep polarization are not only about legal technicalities or the fate of Netanyahu, they are about an economic model that has failed to deliver broadly shared prosperity. People feel the squeeze of housing, healthcare, and inequality, and they are channeling their frustration through whatever political battles are available. This is why the protests are so large, why they cut across sectors of society, why they reveal deep mistrust of the ruling elite. And it is why repression is intensifying, because the system cannot address the root causes. The ruling class cannot abandon neoliberalism without undermining its own wealth, and it cannot abandon militarism without undermining its geopolitical role, so it tries to manage dissent with authoritarian measures, judicial changes, and nationalist rhetoric. But this only fuels further anger. When I say Israel will never be the same, I mean in part that this economic model has reached its breaking point. It cannot continue to promise prosperity while delivering inequality. It cannot continue to promise security while delivering perpetual conflict. It cannot continue to sustain legitimacy while relying on militarism and occupation. The contradictions are too deep, too visible, too explosive. The choice ahead is not between stability and instability, it is between different forms of transformation. One path leads toward deeper authoritarianism, more repression, harsher neoliberalism coupled with stronger nationalism. The other path leads toward a reckoning with inequality, with occupation, with the need for a new social contract. History tells us that ruling classes rarely choose the second path willingly. They have to be forced, pushed by movements from below, by people demanding something better. Whether that will emerge in Israel remains to be seen, but what is certain is that the old system is crumbling before our eyes. If we now turn from the economy to the structure of Israeli society itself, we see even more clearly why the situation has become untenable, why the old order cannot hold. Israeli society has always been fragmented, but fragmentation is not by itself fatal. Many societies are diverse, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and yet they find ways of managing, of creating overlapping identities that make a sense of common belonging possible. The problem in Israel is that the divisions are not just cultural or religious, they are institutionalized in the economy, in politics, and in daily life. They have been reproduced generation after generation in ways that prevent integration, and they are now reaching a breaking point. To understand this, consider the historical composition of the society. At the founding of the state, the dominant group were Ashkenazi Jews, primarily from Europe. They were the architects of the Zionist project, the planners of the early economy, the leaders of the institutions. Their worldview was largely secular, socialist in rhetoric, if not always in practice, and they imagined Israel as a modern, Western-style state. But from the beginning, they brought in waves of immigrants who did not fit that mold. Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews from Arab and Muslim countries who often faced discrimination and were relegated to poorer housing, poorer jobs, and social marginalization. Over time, that resentment grew, and it fueled the rise of right-wing politics that challenged Ashkenazi dominance. Later, the arrival of Russian immigrants in the 1990s, hundreds of thousands of them after the collapse of the Soviet Union, added another layer. Many of them were secular, highly educated, and they brought with them both skills and political conservatism. They integrated into certain sectors, but also formed their own distinct communities with their own media, their own political parties. Ethiopian Jews arriving through airlifts in the 1980s and 1990s faced blatant racism, poverty, and exclusion. Ultra-Orthodox Jews, meanwhile, have always constituted a unique community, religiously insular, resistant to secular culture, demanding subsidies for their large families and religious schools, often exempt from military service, and increasingly assertive in politics. Finally, there are the Palestinian citizens of Israel, about 1 in 5 of the population, who live with structural discrimination in land, employment, and political representation. These communities do not simply live side by side, they live in different social universes. Their children attend different schools, they live in different towns or neighborhoods, they watch different television, they follow different political leaders. The glue that was supposed to hold this fragmented society together has been twofold. First, the constant invocation of external threat, the wars with Arab states, the occupation of Palestinian territories, the tension with Iran, all of this was used to foster a sense of unity, however superficial, against a common enemy. Second, the promise of economic advancement, the idea that Israel is a modern, successful country with opportunities for upward mobility, a country where hard work and ingenuity could yield prosperity. For decades, those adhesives functioned. People tolerated inequality, tolerated discrimination, tolerated political corruption because they believed they were part of a larger project that justified sacrifice. But today, those adhesives are failing. Younger generations do not feel the same existential fear their grandparents did. They see the occupation not as a defensive necessity, but as an endless moral and political quagmire. They see the international criticism, the isolation, the hypocrisy of claiming democracy while ruling millions of Palestinians without rights. They question the narrative of permanent threat, and therefore the call to unity falls flat. Meanwhile, the economic promise has crumbled for large swaths of society. Housing is out of reach, wages are stagnant, inequality is glaring. People feel abandoned by the state, betrayed by leaders who enrich themselves, while telling citizens to tighten their belts. The social contract is unraveling. This is why we see enormous protests not only about judicial reform or specific policies, but about the very legitimacy of the state apparatus. When people flood the streets week after week, it is not just about technical legal issues. It is about a deep sense that the system is not working for them, that the promises are broken, that they no longer believe in the glue that once bound society together. And here is a point that must be emphasized. A fragmented society can survive if there is trust in institutions that mediate between groups. But in Israel, that trust is collapsing. The judiciary is under assault, the government is paralyzed, the political parties are consumed by infighting. There is no institution that commands respect across communities. The Army once played that role as the one institution seen as above politics, the defender of the nation. But even that is eroding. Young people question the endless conscription, the repeated wars, the use of the military as a gatekeeper for privilege in civilian life, the refusal of elite reservists to serve in protest of government policies is unprecedented and shows how deep the cracks have become. When the Army itself becomes politicized, the last common institution is lost. The danger of such fragmentation is not only paralysis, but radicalization. Communities that feel excluded turn inward, reinforce their insularity, and demand more for themselves at the expense of others. Ultra-Orthodox parties demand subsidies and autonomy. Secular Jews resent them. Mizrahi communities feel exploited. Ashkenazi elites cling to privilege. Palestinians face growing hostility. This spiral produces a politics of division where leaders compete not to build common ground, but to mobilize their base against others. That is why Israeli politics has become a carousel of elections with no stable government. It is not just about one man, Netanyahu, though he symbolizes the corruption and manipulation of the system. It is about a society that cannot agree on what it is, who belongs, and what the future should look like. This is the social reality that underpins the economic and political crisis. And it is why Israel, after tonight, will not be the same, because societies can muddle through fragmentation when external threats feel immediate and when economic growth is broadly shared. But when the threats are questioned and the growth is captured by elites, fragmentation becomes unmanageable. It turns into open conflict, mass protest, and delegitimization of institutions. That is what we are witnessing now. And once society reaches this stage, it does not go back to what it was. The old narratives lose their power. The old promises ring hollow. The old elites are seen as corrupt. Something new must emerge. It could be a harsher nationalism, a turn toward authoritarianism that forces unity by repression. Or it could be a movement for genuine equality, for a society that acknowledges diversity without institutionalizing exclusion, that confronts the occupation rather than denying it. The path is uncertain, but the end of the old order is clear. When I say that Israel will never be the same, I mean that the fragmentation of society has reached a point of no return. The divisions are too deep, the trust too eroded, the promises too broken. The young do not believe what their parents believed. The excluded will not accept permanent marginalization. The elites cannot continue to hoard wealth and power without facing backlash. This is not a temporary crisis. This is a transformation. History is filled with examples: South Africa under apartheid, the United States during the civil rights era, Europe in the wake of colonial collapse. In each case, societies built on structural divisions eventually reached a breaking point when the old glue no longer held. That is where Israel is today. That is why after tonight, Israel will never be the same.